This morning is going to be a different morning for us for several reasons. Um, Vic Cardwell and I conspired on you here, and you have now received this little overview. It's actually one of George Herbert's poems called Prayer. He did more than one, and this is the first one, though, Prayer 1. And it's so you'll want to take this with you. I was wanting to talk with you about a few poems, 3 I've selected out of George Herbert's. There's a bunch of poems I've learned over the years, and among those, George Herbert has the largest number. There's just about 15 of them that I like so much that I learned them, or in some cases need to relearn them. That's the problem. I did know them, and some of them I know well, some of you they slip, but they're that good. And one of them is called Prayer. And another one is called The Pulley, and this is. I'm going to first talk about this poem, and I'm going to do 3 poems, and I'll tell you why I'm doing this and how I'm going to relate this to the spiritual life, because this is another way of using wisdom, earthbound understanding and wisdom, to point beyond to and using the experience of godly men to give us perspective on how they internalized and incorporated the journey that we ourselves are discussing. And these are hundreds of years ago. So here is a man who lived from 1593 to 1633. He was only 39 when he died of tuberculosis. And the amazing thing is that Herbert, I've been reflecting on this. I was telling Stuart on my drive over here that I have a discipleship group that meets once a month. And happened that we were on chapter 23 of Conform to His Image in this group. And that's the chapter on gratitude and contentment. Very profoundly important. If you haven't read that chapter, or even if you have, I'd like you to reread that chapter, Gratitude and Contentment, because it's related to an issue that I've been wrestling with as well. I know that Herbert did this. He was born in Wales. He was brilliant, came from a good family, and went to Trinity College in Cambridge, and was so incredibly skilled, he became the orator of Cambridge and got the court's attention. James I then brought him in, and he had a promising position and a career there, because he was so incredibly brilliant and witty and able to position things and write so beautifully and just to communicate. Well, what happened was that fell through after James died, and things changed. And I don't know fully the reason, but he chose to go, and he chose the way of anonymity, of downward mobility, and he actually went to a small parish that was about 10 miles south of Salisbury, in Salisbury Plain. And there he served people in anonymity. And frankly, they never knew who was really ministering to their needs as a curate, a rector rather. And so here is this man who's doing this, and then on his deathbed, he sends this manuscript called The Temple that he'd been working on for the previous several years. He gave it to his friend Nicholas Farrar, and in this note to Farrar, he said, "This is something that has really summarized my own spiritual journey, these prayers and these poems in the temple." He says, "If you find them to be of value, go ahead and do what you want with them, otherwise burn them." Had he burned them, we would have lost one of what is now one of England's most celebrated poets. That one volume called The Temple, which is an image and all the metaphors that are therein of the incredible mind that you have here. So at the very least, I'd like you to kind of meditate on some of his works. And 3 of the ones I'm going to give you are The Pulley, and then I'm going to talk about Prayer, and then The Elixir. And I'll tell you why I'm going to be doing that, because each one of these relates to you and to me in very real ways. So first of all, then, do make a note to go ahead and read chapter 23 of Conform to His Image. That's the first thing. And then the second thing would be, I'd like you to read these 3 poems. You can find them, you can search for them and get them. And I'd like you to study them. So in the first poem that Herbert wrote then, again, as this genius in anonymity as is conveying these things. I'm not going to be able to study the entirety of the poem. It's very complex and elegant. The way he paces it, the nature of the hexameter, and all the other components of the poetry. I'm just going to pull out the reason why I love this poem is because it's an illustration of the most fundamental need we have, and that is for that which is beyond ourselves, for that which is trans-temporal and trans-finite. It is God himself. And remember, Augustine wrote, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." And that is what this poem is about. So if we, just going to make it a little bit larger for you. When God at first made man, having a glass of blessings standing by. So I have this image here. Let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches which dispersed lie contract into a span. So here's what he's doing with this first image here. At the creation of man, the pinnacle of his created order, he has a glass of blessings standing by. It's almost like a liquor. It's like something that one would pour out, a concentrated liquid. And it's in this glass. And he's making man, and he's going to take this glass and he's going to pour these gifts upon him, one by one, upon his new creation. And so it says, let us, said he, pour on him all we can. Let the world's riches which dispersed lie contract into a span. What he's saying is, let all the goods that this world can provide, let me reduce them to a span, which I'm showing you right now. It's half a cubit is 9 inches approximately from your tip of your finger to little finger to your thumb. So it's a span. So all of this is going to contract into this span. It's going to pour this little bit, this liquid, and it's going to pour in him these exquisite gifts. So it's all the world's riches. I'm going to concentrate it. They're dispersed, but I'm going to make them contract into this one span. So strength first made a way. Then beauty flowed. Then wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure rest in the bottom lay. So this is, we'll stop there for a moment here. So why would you just look at the order? Strength, of course, would make its way first, as its nature would be. Then beauty would flow, you see. And so one of the themes that's become characteristic of my own apprehension and aspiration of late is beauty. I'm dazzled by beauty in nature now and don't know how I overlooked it before. I always saw it, but now I'm seeing it in a way that's entirely different. I'm using nature as a force multiplier for worship because of the glory of the created order. So beauty flowed. And then wisdom, honor, pleasure. What great gifts these are. Wisdom, honor, pleasure. When almost all was out, God made us stay, perceiving that alone of all his treasure, rest in the bottom lay. This one little thing I could give him, but I'm going to hold back. He made us stay. Why? For he said, if I should, said he, bestow this jewel also my creature, he would adore my gifts instead of me and rest in nature, not the God of nature, so both should losers be. You see what he's doing with that? So if I gave him that thing as well, if I gave that creature rest, then he would adore my gifts instead of me, and find his rest in nature, not the God of nature. So both would losers be. Both would lose out. So he would lose out and everything would not be as it was meant to be. So he chooses to withhold this one gift. He's displayed everything, given it all to him, but he holds back this one thing. He says, but I love this, yet let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. Let him be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Now, think about that. Let him keep the rest. So you see he's using equivocation here. He's using rest in an entirely different way as the rest of the material, but it's an intentional play on words. Let him keep the rest, but keep them with repining restlessness. He'll never be satisfied with the things that the world provides. Let them be rich and weary, that at least if goodness lead them not, yet weariness may toss them to my breast. Now that's what I mean by you've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. You have nowhere else to go, because nothing else, no earthbound felicity, no earthbound joy, nothing will fully satisfy your desire, because you were meant for more than anything that you could have. So you're rich and weary, and that goodness will toss them to my breast. And it's an incredible thing. In fact, Karl Rahner put it this way: in the torment of the insufficiency of everything attainable, we learn that ultimately in this world there is no finished symphony. I'm going to read that again. In the torment of the insufficiency of everything attainable. You see what he's saying? What does he mean, the torment? It means that we hope that this will satisfy. No, it let me down. Another. You're in a torment. You're tormented by the insufficiency of the goods of this world, which will never give you rest. We learn that ultimately in this world there is no finished symphony. In Daniel Pink, A Whole New Mind, abundance has brought beautiful things to our lives, but that bevy of material goods has not necessarily made us much happier. The paradox of prosperity is that while living standards have risen steadily, decade after decade, personal, family, and life satisfaction haven't budged. That is why more people, liberated by prosperity but not fulfilled by it, are seeking to resolve the paradox by searching for meaning. The most striking feature of contemporary culture is the unslaked craving for transcendence. Most people, though, even in spite of that reality, somehow successfully avoid raising and wrestling with the basic questions: where did I come from? Who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? So the question, who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? Are the three great basic questions, are they not? Of identity, of purpose, and of hope. And a man can't live properly and effectively without identity, a secure basis for identity, something that gives you significance and security and satisfaction that is bigger than anything this world can provide. And I think that's what Herbert was talking about there in that poem. The whole idea of something that's bigger than anything that this world can provide for you, because after all, security is not going to be found in this world. We've talked about this multiple times before, but when we think about this whole idea of, but just by way of reminder again, is this whole idea of the basic needs we all share in one form or another. Even though our personalities and our approaches may be different, we have these fundamental needs. And it is this poem that's telling us that only God will provide these needs. You'll not find them on this earth. That the symphony is never going to be finished in this world. But we're waiting for a better home, a better good, a better joy. In fact, that reminds me of another quote that I had here that I wanted to, when Johann Sebastian Bach said, "Do not cry for me, for I go to where music is born." Wow, that's a powerful, powerful picture. I go to where music is born. So that when you see that, then he tells you, I know where I'm going. I'm going home. And I know that people are not enough to provide for security. I let them down, they let me down. That significance, possessions, are not enough. I was with Pete Bodie, and we had an interesting drive along parts of Atlanta, and our back way that you cleverly took to get us to the Marietta area. And I saw a street that I didn't remember seeing this way. I was just overwhelmed by the oppressive endeavors of men to show I matter. Look at me, look at me. I'm big. I'm bigger than you. No, look at me. And the cupolas and these things. And it's not enough. It's people who are desperate to prove that they matter. And they're all doing the same darn thing. And it's incredible. It's just they do it in a bigger scale than they. So this is, again, what I call the octopus syndrome. Remember Paul Wright, when he bought this yacht. It was the largest personal yacht in the world. And just as it was being finished, someone else was building a larger person. And since that time, 6 others have been built, one after the other, each one leading to another. It's never enough, is it? You see, the heart longs for something. But you see, it's like me, 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 me. And often those will be places where there may be a family of 2 or possibly 4 in hidden halls and rooms that haven't been haunted in years, except someone cleans them. But it's just amazing. Why do people do that for possessions when they know if they look around, it's never enough? No one's ever been satisfied by possessions. And then third, satisfaction. The significance. That significance isn't your basis. Satisfaction is not found in position and performance. That's too thin, superficial. We need more than any of these things that the world can offer us. And that is why we need security in the Father. That is why we need our significance in the Son. That is why we need our satisfaction in the Holy Spirit. And it's been something that I've been seeking to communicate to you a lot of late, this quest for me to ask this question. And I keep coming back to it because I'm seeking to use this multiple times a day. And I would like you to try using these 3 questions multiple times a day. The first question, we've talked about this before, but I'm just reminding you. The first and last questions of Jesus, which are recorded only in John's Gospel. What do you seek? And then, do you love me more than these? Those are incredible bookends. Incredible books. This is not an accident. But then at Caesarea Philippi, in this retreat with his disciples, he asks the disciples a poignant question: who do men say that I am? And then they give their speculations, as they would do. And then, but who do you say I am? And that is the question that ultimately everyone must answer. You are going to have to answer that question. Who do you say that I am? And in doing so, then, you're really wrestling with the fundamental questions in that of life that Jesus makes evident, all really revolve around him. All the scriptures pointed to him. He is the Word incarnate. He is the maker of the world and the redeemer of the world. And so when we see that he comes into the world and becomes one with us, this is an incredible concept. It's beyond imagination that he would plummet in this way. So these 3 questions I want you to use in this way. Right now, it's at some point today, the first time you use it, at this very point, what do I want more than anything else? What do I seek more than anything else? What do I long for? Because it's a good question to ask, because it's the most important thing about you, what you want. You become conformed by that to which you aspire. The idea then, who do you say, who is Jesus to me right now? And do I love him more than these? And you know what the these will be. It'll depend on what the situation is. It may be this situation, it may be these people, it may be that success. Do you love me more than those things? And your prayer would be then to want to know him better. And so that's really what it comes down to when I think about that. So your prayer, speaking of that, then brings us to Herbert's poem on prayer, which is what you now have in this little card. And so having begun the journey, that at least weariness may toss them to my breast. And that's the pulley, by the way. He never uses the word pulley, but he says that's the pulley that he uses to pull you, to draw you inexorably to himself. It is your very weariness. If people will not come to him because of gratitude, but weariness, so let it be. But his desire then will eventually come to love him for himself and not just for his gifts. Now, in this wonderful prayer, he uses 26 metaphors and not one verb. And I think the metaphors correspond perhaps to the 26 letters in the English alphabet. There's so much behind what he does. And he brilliantly uses no connections, no conjunctions, layering one after another, metaphors of divine metaphors of prayer, first of all. and then we'll see other kinds of metaphors. He says, so let me just read it for you. And prayer, the church's banquet, angel's age, God's breath in man returning to his birth. The soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage. The Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth. Engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reverse thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best. Heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise. Church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Very powerful images these are to me. Let's explore them together and just see what we've got, because what he's saying is prayer is so rich, so full. Why do then men not talk to God? Why do they not communicate? This is the dynamic of the duality of communion and communication with God. It's the church's banquet, which is very, very much a congregational aspect in this, because it's talking about the Eucharist. And so that as we celebrate together, and it's a love feast, you see. It's a banquet that we not only have, we don't have this banquet individually, do we? No one wants to be at a banquet by himself. You go to a world-class restaurant and you're sitting by yourself having 10 courses. There's something wrong with that picture. It's meant to be shared, is it not? So also table fellowship, a major theme. The angel's age, and so he's looking at angels who really will never die, and they are spiritual beings. So he's talking about the imagery of eternity. So prayer feeds us, and it lasts forever. It reflects back and forth to all things that God has made, and so it will endure forever. It is God's breath in man returning to his birth. And what you have here, of course, is going back to Genesis, when God breathed into him a living breath. Remember that idea, the nephesh? And so he gave him the breath of life in Genesis 2:7. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So God's breath animated this clay figure that he had put together out of the earth. And he animates him and fills him with life, does he not? What's happening in this then? God's breath, it says, in man returning to his birth. Now he's taking the very breath that he received and giving it back to God in prayer. You see the idea? That vitality of the soul, where he's offering it back to God and it's returning to his birth. The soul in paraphrase is another beautiful divine metaphor. A paraphrase is when you explain an author's thoughts, you tease it out, you unpack it, as it were. And so our souls, in a very real way then, need to can take their conditions of their souls and bring them up to God. Sometimes it's a hardship for this to take place. There are, for example, psalms, as in Psalm 88, that is a hard psalm. It's a psalm of lament, and where the psalmist cries out, and one of the sons of Korah, and he says, I've cried out day and in the night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear. My soul has had enough troubles. My life is drawn near to Sheol. I'm reckoned as among those who go down to the pit. So what he's doing here in the soul, in paraphrase, is he's teasing out his pain and offering it to his daddy. You see, he's saying, I hurt. And that is a very real thing and a good thing for him to do, and it's proper that we should do. He feels that he's forsaken among the dead, and nevertheless, it's something he wrestles with, but he wrestles with it before God, and that is, I've called upon you every day, O Lord. I've spread my hands out to you. And so he wrestles with God, and that's one way of wrestling with God. But there's another way of doing it also. One psalm, by contrast, Psalm 136, is a song of recollection. And it is this, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting. So this is a psalm of thanksgiving. And you'll notice it takes you through in Psalm 136, Israel's history. So it starts with the God of gods, the Lord of hosts, the one who does great wonders, who made the heavens with skill. You notice it's followed every one for his loving kindness is everlasting. So it's a beautiful thing. So he's giving Israel's history, but punctuating it with God's loving kindness. It's a beautiful poem. So he made the great lights, the sun to rule by day, the moon and stars to rule by night. He smote the Egyptians in their firstborn, brought Israel out in their midst. And again, his loving kindness is everlasting. So what you see here is this portrait then of God's greatness and grace in this, the soul and paraphrase then. And the heart and pilgrimage. And the idea of the pilgrimage, people knew about the Canterbury Tales, of course, at this time. It recounted the travels of 30 pilgrims. And it's a metaphor of the Christian journey. And my own metaphor that I like to use is this metaphor of rewriting your broken story, where you see the road here. The pilgrim begins, we go out of the world, and then along the way, so God gave you a new story, pulled you out of this world and called you into his. And that's the past and the present. You're to practice his presence in living in light of eternity. And then in the future, we're shaped by suffering so that we are being prepared in for our eternal citizenship in the heavenlies and place. So we're all pilgrims then. So the whole concept of the heart of pilgrimage, you see, in pilgrimage. The Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth. I love this image because a plummet was something that would be used. In fact, this is a tangible metaphor of prayer. So he's changing the kinds of prayer metaphors he's using. In this case, he's now, instead of divine metaphors, he's using metaphors that some involve these creative works, but some a measure of violence, as you'll see. Now, what was a plummet? It would be a line that you'd drop down and to determine the depth of the ocean or the lake or where you happen to be. So you'd sound it. You'd do a sounding. What do you have here? He's reversing it. The plummet's going upwards. So he's plummeting heaven and earth by reverse plummeting. You see the idea? So now heaven is that ocean that he reaches. And earth and heaven somehow connect. And that's a powerful picture. Engine against the Almighty. What typical engines of that time, because there's some of the kings who loved to make engines of war. And one would be a catapult. And some of those were pretty impressive catapults that they also battering rams. And they would use as engines of war so they could defeat the enemy's opposition. They could defeat their foundations, their barriers. And so it's an engine against the... What does that mean? It's like saying you are now plummeting God. You're pummeling him. You're actually sending your emotions and so forth. He cares enough for you, and that you work with him. And it's like an engine. Sometimes in your anger, have you ever been angry with God? It is a good thing, instead of complaining about other people, to show your anger to God because he knows. Have you ever, if you have children, hasn't your child sometimes hit you and said, why did you allow this to happen? And so it's the child then wrestling with the father, but it's the father who cares enough for him. He's not going to care about the assault. That's not the issue. But it's assaults. It's a pummeling of his heart. And so it speaks to his heart. And so the Christian plummet, engine, sinner's tower. Now he switches it. One is a weapon of offense. This one's a weapon of defense, where you go into the tower and you are secure. So sometimes prayer can be a weapon of an engine of war. And it's part of the warfare that we pray with all prayer and petition. So that's part of the armor of God in terms of and prayer and the Word of God are the two offensive weapons in the armor of God. Then he says, sinner's tower, reverse thunder. And Vic and I love that phrase, reverse thunder, because it's this beautiful picture of something going back to God. When I think about thunder, and I look at this thunder, and you can see it battering down, and sometimes you're terrified. Suddenly you hear this awful clap. It's near you, and you're overwhelmed. And so it would be then, imagine then you're reversing it. This is prayer. It's like reverse thunder. It's an image of prayer coming up to God, you see. It's like a metaphor of prayer. And so it is actually sending thunder, sending lightning back to God. And so it's, to me, a powerful metaphor indeed. There's also Christ's side-piercing spear. And as I see it then, the side-piercing spear is that we arrive at the supreme act of violence. These were violent acts, as we've described, or were they not? The whole idea of engine and Sinner's Tower, reverse thunder, but now suddenly the most violent thing takes place, where the spear penetrates in his body near his heart. And so this whole idea of our prayers take us to the heart of Christ then. And he feels the pain of our laments as we, like the Roman soldier, pierces his side with our prayer-headed spears, as one person wrote. I like that concept. Then we have the 6 days world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear. We return again to Genesis here with the first 6 days of creation. And to transpose a piece of music, what's that involve? It involves changing it into a different key. So the transposition of music then is what's taking place. It's a kind of tune. It transposes the creation into a new key of our own device. And this, it's a kind of tune. In other words, an hour of prayer can change the world as much as God did in creating those 6 days. The world-altering prayer results, reverent awe, and for the one who made it. So it has a power that it reaches up and then also reaches down. And then there are different kinds. Instead of these other tangible metaphors for prayer, what we now have are what one writer described as sweet metaphors for prayer, and I think that's right. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss. Prayer brings softness into these. It produces the fruit of the Holy Spirit in our lives. And so that's why it's been a sweet hour of prayer. The joys I feel, the bliss I share. So finding that kind of sweetness can really elevate our souls. You see, there's a softness and a peace and a joy and a love and a bliss. And this beautiful tune which we hear elevated into the fruit of the Spirit. Exalted manna. Now, in the Old Testament, of course, what happened is God fed his people with manna from heaven. Here is manna from earth going back to God. You see the same. Give us this day our daily bread, but now you're taking your daily bread and you're offering it back to God, to its exalted manna once again. And then he says, gladness of the best. And so it seems to me that this is the experience of his blessings, to give thanks in everything. And God gives us his best. When I think of James chapter 1, going to James 1, and I see this beautiful picture of what life is like, that God has made, and all things he's made with excellence and wonder. It's in verse 17. Every good gift, every good thing given, and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So it's a beautiful picture then of how we too can actually have this sense of exalted manna and of gladness of the best, that he gives us the best. He doesn't just give us junk. Heaven and ordinary, man well dressed. As I see it, heaven and ordinary, prayer takes the ordinary and elevates it into the extraordinary. And man well dressed, who told you were naked? Is a motif, the idea of nakedness. And now we are clothed with the righteousness of Christ. Put on the new man and take off the old. So you're now well dressed. You're dressed with the righteousness of Christ. And the fine linen, the white linen, is the righteous deeds of the saint. The Milky Way, I love this, the bird of paradise. If you think about the Milky Way and what is Herbert seeing here? Skies that very few people see this bright, this brilliantly, because of the pollution and corruption, but still, in Herbert's day, he would have seen beautiful Milky Ways. And you can see this image here of looking up, and you see the stars above, You wouldn't know what they were, but there was something extraordinary that captures you and draws you, and is something as this canopy of stars that overwhelms you sometimes. When I look up at the stars, I'm looking really down in the stars. There's no up and down in that case. So there's a sense of the transcendence, a beautiful picture. And then he also not only looks at the cosmos and the heavens, but he also looks at back to the earth and the bird of paradise, which in mythology, Greek mythology, the birds of paradise would never light. Didn't have feet, so they eternally remained in the air. That was the idea of what they meant by that. But the idea of one that's always hovering, always soaring, always there before God. And then church bells beyond the stars heard, which I love, because traditionally, when you hear church bells, what's that going to do? It alerts you to go to hear that. Instead, what we're now doing is we're God's church bells. See the idea? Instead of church bells bringing us to church, we're God's church bells bringing him to us. And there's a very amazing concept then, whereby you are welcoming something in that goes beyond. It signifies our prayers are not discordant clanging, but he hears them in musical beauty and accord. And then finally, the soul's blood in the land of spices. The soul's blood, and I think of this, the life is in the blood, and it is your vitality that it is. But it also ends up with these two beautiful pictures, the land of spices. And what I see, by the way, softness relates to the sense of touch, you see. And then if we were to look at it this way here, let me just comment on this here. So you have softness relates to the sense of touch, and then manna of taste, and then the Milky Way, that's a sight, and the church bells are the sound, and the spices are the smell. You see, and so I love spices. I love the beauty of them. They just amaze me when I look at these. I mean, just the color and the variety that people have organized and ordered together. I mean, I like to play in that. It's almost like you just wonder, what on earth is this pink thing? And what would I do with it in food, you see? Because that's how you'd play with spices, try them out and taking risks. What on earth is this blue thing? But I love it. I like the looks of it. And then these things, you see? So wonderful things. The land of spices. It also evokes something, I think, exotic, doesn't it? There's an exotic dimension, the land of spices, going off to a place that has not yet been visited. And then the last and most important words, something understood, something connected between me and him. A mutual understanding, a resonance, a communion, a communication. So that when I think of this psalm, this poem, it makes me think of Hebrews chapter, let me find it for you here. Hebrews chapter 4, which is, I think, very critical for our understanding. Because he says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. So he's passed through from heaven to earth. And then he rises us from earth to heaven. Let us hold fast our confession. We don't have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin, which I love. So he knows what it's like to go through temptations of this world. But he also has overcome and without sin. And he invites us to walk in his power so that we too can be overcomers. Therefore, he says, let us draw near with confidence. That was the name for what became Handbook to Prayer, drawing near. And it was a 1 month guide. And so then we changed it and made it a 3 month, but drawing near. Let's draw near with confidence to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So that's a beautiful portrait, is it not, of what prayer was really meant to be about. Something understood. Now I'm going to give you a much shorter exposition of a third poem, because this poem is exceedingly important to me, and it's something that I want you to chew on, because it relates to you and the way you live your life. It's called the elixir. So an elixir, is like a tonic. It's something that would be extracted, something that would make it meaningful and powerful. Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for thee. So when I hear that first stanza then, teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see. Everything matters. Seeing him in the routine, the ordinary, the mundane. How can I see God this day in the people that I meet with? To see him in the activities I'm dealing with. What I love about this particular poem is he's inviting us to practicing his presence. He's inviting us to receive and respond and reply and resonate with the glory of God in a way that actually takes the ordinary and transmutes it into the extraordinary. So it is this thing that he's saying that makes it all the difference. In everything, to do it as for thee. Not rudely as a beast to run into an action, but still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. So what he's saying here is that this is not a matter of doing things instinctually, by rote, because that's so easy to do. So much of religion. I'm not a religious, but people say, are you religious? I say no. Because what most people mean by religion is man's efforts to earn or please or placate God or whatever it might be, or ritual and routine. And at the end of the day, I want something that's alive. It's a relationship and it's a romance. So it's much more than one. And that's why I'm saying, not rudely, this isn't just some mechanical thing. This is a life-giving thing. To run into an action, but no, make you prepossessed and give it his perfection. So, in other words, to make and be intentional about my acts. To make him prepossessed in my mind. If my intention is the service of Christ, it elevates the lead of the ordinary into the gold of the extraordinary by turning it into something that matters. Again, as I said, there are no little people, no little places, no little things. Everything you do, whether trivial or not, matters. I spend more time than I ever did before doing stuff in the kitchen. Hadn't done that before, but now I'm doing that. Now, how do I view that? Do I view that as an offering to God? Do I view it as an opportunity to do it with excellence, even though no one's looking? And that's the key, playing to an invisible audience of one. So he says, still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. A man who looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleases, through it pass, and then the heavens espy. And so what he says in this third stanza, you can look at imagine in Elizabethan England there's a small window, and you can look at the window, and you can see the cobwebs or all these odds and ends there. You can look at the window. A man who looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleases, he may have to make a choice. Do I make a choice? If I choose, I can actually go past it, through it pass, and then the heavens espy. Stuart and I were talking in a podcast we're doing, and we were talking about C.S. Lewis's reflections on a tool shed, and how he, growing up, went into a tool shed and had that experience of seeing the light flowing down there. And I had the same thing when I was growing up. And in my summers, I spent my boyhood summers in Monroe, Louisiana. And I remember my grandfather had this tool shed, and it had a chink in it, and it was a sunny day, and all the things were floating around. And Mr. Curiosity, as a kid would do, you don't want to just look at it. You want to go until you finally go to the end of it and look along it. You see down the thing. You see all of a sudden what happens? In that moment of time, something magical takes place, doesn't it? So no longer is it a light floating with dust in a tool shed. It's the sun, 93 million miles away. It is the trees. It is the sky. You see the difference it makes? And so this whole idea of you have an eternal perspective. So you can look at the window, or you can look through the window, your choice. You can either look at things from an earthbound perspective, or you can see them as vehicles through which you can actually behold the purposes of God in the ordinary and the mundane. And so he goes on to then say, This is, go to the next one here. Here. All may of thee partake, nothing can be so mean, that with this tincture for thy sake will not grow bright and clean. So what does he mean? All may of thee partake. Everyone's available. He's available for all. There's no social distinction here in any way. All the distinctions of men are passed by. All get to participate. And nothing can be so mean. What does he mean by mean? I think he means ordinary, rude, trivial. Nothing can be so mean, so perfunctory, that it cannot be transmuted into something bigger and better. That is to say, with this tincture, this drop, as it were, with this material, this elixir, for thy sake, that's the tincture. That's the tincture, for thy sake. Whatever you do for thy sake suddenly grows bright and clean. The mundane, the mean becomes elevated into the beautiful and the clean. You see the concept there? He then goes on to say, a servant with this clause, I love this, a servant with this clause makes drudgery divine. Who sweeps a room as for thy laws makes that in the action fine. So this is an amazing text for me. A servant. Now, again, Herbert died in 1633. So he was in Elizabethan England. He was basically a man who lived in the countryside. And in many cases, in that part of the country especially, charcoal was used both to heat the homes as well as for cooking. So they hired a person that they called a charwoman. Get the name? Char for charcoal. They hired a charwoman, and this charwoman would have to come on a periodic basis to sweep the charcoal and also to sweep the chimney, so all of that. I suppose when the charwoman came, it would not be a social visit. This is a person who has a kind of a mean task. It's not a person of any dignity whatsoever. So it'd be rather almost you'd have to endure their presence while they're cleaning up for you, you see. But you wouldn't really note them or welcome them in a certain way. And therefore, their work, no matter what, would not be regarded as being very valuable, or it's certainly not noticed very much. But here's what he says. A servant with this clause, with that understanding of this tincture for thy sake, makes drudgery divine. You can take a drudgery thing and turn it exquisite and make it, here's what he says, who sweeps a room as for thy laws. That's the charwoman. So who does that for the glory of God suddenly does two things. It makes that in the action fine. What do you mean by that? I think that is the position, the work she's doing. Suddenly she's as dignified, the work she's doing is as dignified as being an ambassador to France. The work of being a charwoman is made fine. You see the point there? And then the action, what do you think he means by that? My guess is, I think it's right, is that the action is the way in which the work is done. In other words, she does it with such excellence because she's doing it with greater excellence than if she was seeking to impress people. So then when you seek to be pleasing to Jesus, your work will actually be more consistently excellent because, and you will have greater integrity because you're not trying to impress people. So you cannot try to impress people and please Jesus at the same time. You're playing to two disparate audiences. Never works. So you have to choose your audience. But if you're seeking to be pleasing to him for thy sake, suddenly then what happens is everything becomes bright and clean, you see. So it's just a wonderful image then. So the way her work is, she is doing her work as unto the Lord, and it has a dignity. And whenever I think of that, I always think about my first visit to Westminster Abbey. I've told you this before, but it's just a fun story because Karen and I, the typical thing, the first time ever to England, it was around 1980, and we did the little red bus, the tour bus. You see, he'd stop you off, and then every 15 minutes another bus would come by, so you'd go on the usual tour. When we were dropped off at Westminster Abbey, happened to hear an articulate tour guide, and we said, well, let's listen to her, and so we did. And she was commenting on how the statues had been removed for cleaning. Then they had not done that for 700 years. So you imagine, we happened to be there when they removed the statues from the chancery for the first time in 700 years. And then she said, you can imagine their amazement when they saw that the backsides were carved as beautifully as the front. Even though when put in place, no one would notice. What's that mean to you? God will. So he sees behind the sheetrock, if you're a builder. He sees the quality of your materials. He sees the excellence of your work or the shoddiness of your work. And fidelity in a small thing adds up to fidelity in much. Faithfulness in a small thing adds up to faithfulness in much. So it does matter. So what happens is then, it's not only the work that you do that's elevated to greatness. So if I make Karen a meal, it's accorded then a great act, you see, and I want to do it well. I want it to look great, even though it's so ephemeral. But all our works are ephemeral. They're all brief. It's just, I wouldn't want to make a great meal and then have people and consume it like that, because I put my heart into that thing. But you see, but it's all your works are like that meal. As soon as you're done, we think that it will last forever. It won't. So having an eternal perspective is what makes all the difference. Well, he says, mix that in the action fine, and then the final stanza. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold. For that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. And so what is he saying? This is the philosopher's stone. And as you know, he's referring to the whole idea of alchemy and the whole idea of using the philosopher's stone and transmuting lead into gold, and they're right next to each other in the periodic table. They're both heavy, but you're not going to. There's no mechanism by which you can actually transmute one to the other. But this stone will do it. So what is he saying? This is the metaphor of the alchemy of grace. In this alchemy, it does transmute. This alchemy transmutes the lead of the ordinary into the grace of the extraordinary. Transmutes the lead of suffering into the grace of glory. And that is the way it should be. So it cannot for less be told. So there you have a security and a significance. So we've talked about 3 poems. The first one then we talked about was the pulley, that God uses our restlessness to draw us to him. And he stoops to conquer. And he wants to be loved for himself and not for his gifts, but he'll stoop to get you. And then he wants you to get him. He wants you to know him and become like him. And that's the whole point of prayer when we talked about that, the communion of the heart and the soul's paraphrase and the land of spices, church bells beyond the stars heard, engine against the Almighty, all these beautiful metaphors, reverse thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, all these beautiful pictures. And that's what prayer is. It's a richer thing than we imagine. And then the third component, and by the way, with prayer, I encouraged us to be on the same page, the same day with Hammer to Prayer. And if you haven't done that, go ahead and start, because this is month 1. It works out well, because January will be month 1, you see. So it's a nice 4 times over here. So this is month 1, and this is day 5. This is Yom Kippur. And so I want you to go ahead and use Hammer to Prayer, and you'll be praying scripture back to God, and I think this poem would be a lovely thing for you to read as well with that. I think that'd be a good way. And if you miss a day, you miss 2 days or 3 days, doesn't matter. Here's what you do: you skip to the next day, to the day of the month, and then you don't beat yourself up over it. And that way you stay in the discipline. I'd love it for us to do that, so consider that. And then we looked at the elixir finally, and this last poem, the elixir that transmutes our ordinary actions and everything that's done with this tincture for thy sake. It will grow bright and clean. And everything you touch will matter. And it'll be the things not only in your calendar, but the things that are not on your calendar. Not only your chronos, but also God's kairos. And so everything will matter.